October 2008. JPMorgan Chase quietly withdraws $275 million from Bernie Madoff's funds. They don't alert the clients. They don't notify the regulators. They say nothing. 2 months later, the largest Ponzi scheme in history collapses. $65 billion, 40,000 victims. The bank had known for over 10 years. No one went to prison. This is the story Wall Street never wanted you to know.
To understand this story, you first need to understand the ground where it was born, the 1990s. Wall Street is living a golden era. Markets keep climbing, and a new class of investors, pension funds, universities, charitable foundations, desperately seeks one thing: stable returns without volatility. This is where Bernie Madoff enters. Madoff was no unknown. His brokerage firm, founded in 1960, processed around 9% of all transactions on the American Stock Exchange. He was chairman of NASDAQ, not once, but 3 times. Let that sink in. The man who would orchestrate the largest fraud in history sat at the tables where the rules of the game were decided, and the system let him operate without questions. Why? Because Wall Street ran on reputation. If you had credentials, no one questioned you. The SEC was underfunded and far too close to those it was supposed to regulate. There was another crucial element: the feeder funds. Funds like Fairfield Greenwich collected money from thousands of investors and funneled it to Madoff. In return, they charged generous commissions. And Madoff's returns? 10 to 12% a year, every year, without fail, even during crises. No one questioned it. After all, he was a former chairman of NASDAQ. But some were suspicious. The warnings existed. They were delivered to the authorities, and they were ignored. Before we get there, we need to understand how a kid from Queens built this empire.
Queens, New York, 1938. Bernie Madoff is born into a lower-middle-class Jewish family. His father was a plumber, his mother a housewife. No connections to Wall Street, no old money. But there was ambition. Young Bernie watched the men in suits in Manhattan and dreamed of becoming one of them. He didn't just want money, he wanted to belong to that world. In 1959, he marries Ruth Alpern, daughter of an accountant. A year later, at just 22 years old, with $5,000 saved from summer jobs, he founds Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities. $5,000, that's how a $65 billion scheme begins. In the early years, Madoff operated as a penny stock broker, cheap stocks that the big firms ignored. Nothing glamorous, but profitable. His father-in-law was crucial. Saul Alpern had clients looking for places to invest. He started directing them to his son-in-law. All informal, personal trust, no questions asked. This model, raising money through networks of trust, would become Madoff's most lethal weapon. Throughout the 70s, the brokerage grew. Madoff bet on something few had mastered: technology. He pioneered computerized trading at a time when everything was still done by phone. When NASDAQ was born in 1971, the world's first electronic stock exchange, Madoff was at the forefront. His firm became one of the largest market makers. It processed millions of transactions. His reputation soared. But the legitimate business didn't satisfy his ambition. The houses in Manhattan, the apartment in Palm Beach, the yachts, the jets, all of this cost more than the brokerage generated. And this is where something changed. Madoff began accepting money to manage, but not through the regulated brokerage, through a parallel, discrete operation on the 17th floor of the Lipstick Building in Manhattan. While the legitimate brokerage operated on the floors below, the 17th floor was forbidden territory. Few employees had access. IBM computers from the 80s, dot matrix printers, deliberately outdated technology. The strategy Madoff claimed to use was called split-strike conversion. In theory, a conservative method that generated consistent returns. The problem? There were no transactions. None. Zero. The money went directly into an account at JPMorgan Chase, the infamous account 703, and came out to pay other investors. New money to pay old investors. The classic definition of a Ponzi scheme. And the auditing firm that validated all of this? Freeling and Horowitz, an office of 200 square feet with 3 employees, one of them retired, another a secretary. This tiny firm audited billions of dollars. How did no one see it? Because the system wasn't designed to see. The SEC had no jurisdiction over that operation. Madoff was exploiting a regulatory black hole at the heart of Wall Street. But someone did see. In Boston, a financial analyst named Harry Markopolos looked at Madoff's numbers and understood immediately it was mathematically impossible. And for 8 years, he tried to warn the world.
The 80s and 90s. The empire grows. Madoff transforms into a silent legend of Wall Street. He didn't give interviews. He didn't appear in magazines. He cultivated an aura of exclusivity, as if investing with him was a privilege reserved for the few. And that's precisely what made him irresistible. His fundraising strategy was genius in its simplicity. Madoff didn't ask for money. He rejected investors. He said the fund was closed, that he wasn't accepting anyone else. This created desperation. People begged to get in. They felt special when they were accepted. Networks of trust did the rest. Country clubs in Palm Beach, synagogues in New York, Jewish philanthropic circles. Madoff moved through these environments with mastery. A discreet gentleman, well-spoken, with an easy smile. Who would suspect? The feeder funds multiplied. Fairfield Greenwich, Tremont Group, Banco Santander, HSBC, UBS, institutions from around the world funneled billions to Madoff without doing the slightest due diligence. The list of victims was staggering. Elie Wiesel, Holocaust survivor, Nobel Peace Prize laureate, lost $15 million from his foundation. $15 million. A man who survived Auschwitz was robbed by a Wall Street con artist. Steven Spielberg, Kevin Bacon, Kyra Sedgwick, John Malkovich, Larry King, Hollywood's elite trusted their savings to Madoff. Universities, hospitals, charitable foundations. Hadassah, the largest Jewish women's organization in the world, had $150 million invested with Madoff. Money flowed from 127 countries, 40,000 victims in total. And no one saw the obvious? Someone did. Harry Markopolos was a financial analyst from Boston. In 1999, a competitor asked him to analyze Madoff's strategy and replicate it. Markopolos looked at the numbers and understood in 5 minutes. It was impossible. Madoff's returns had no correlation with the market. They went up when the market went up. They went up when the market went down. They always went up. No volatility, no losses. Mathematically impossible. Markopolos did the math. To generate those returns with the alleged strategy, Madoff would need to buy more options than existed in the entire global market. In 2000, he sent the first report to the SEC. Title: The World's Largest Hedge Fund is a Fraud. The SEC ignored it. In 2001, he alerted them again. Ignored. In 2005, he sent a 21-page report with 29 red flags. He explained step by step why it was mathematically impossible. The SEC investigated, spoke with Madoff, and concluded there was no evidence of fraud. Markopolos was stunned. He began to fear for his own life. He convinced himself that Madoff had ties to the Russian mafia. He started checking his car before getting in, afraid of bombs. In total, the SEC received 6 formal complaints and conducted 5 investigations into Madoff between 1992 and 2008. None found anything. Why? Because the investigators didn't understand finance, because Madoff was a former chairman of NASDAQ, because the SEC had been captured by the system it was supposed to regulate, and because there were obscene conflicts of interest. Madoff's niece, Shauna, was the firm's compliance attorney. Her husband, Eric Swanson, was one of the SEC lawyers who investigated Madoff in 2003. They married shortly after the investigation was closed. This is the system protecting its own. But the SEC wasn't the only one who knew. JPMorgan Chase, the largest bank in the United States, had maintained Madoff's infamous account 703 since 1986. For 22 years, billions passed through that account, and the bank saw everything. In 1998, internal employees described Madoff's returns as possibly too good to be true, with too many red flags. In 2007, an internal report openly speculated that it could be a Ponzi scheme. The bank knew for over a decade, and what did they do? In October 2008, they quietly withdrew $275 million from funds linked to Madoff. The London unit alerted British authorities that the returns were too good to be true, but they didn't alert American regulators. They didn't warn clients. They didn't say a word. They protected themselves and stayed silent. 2 months later, the castle crumbled.
December 2008. The financial world is in collapse. 3 months earlier, Lehman Brothers imploded. Markets plunged. Credit froze. Panicked investors rushed to redeem their money wherever they could, and they started knocking on Madoff's door. For decades, the scheme had worked because there was always new money coming in. New investors funded the returns of the old ones. As long as the flow continued, the illusion held. But the 2008 financial crisis reversed everything. Instead of deposits, Madoff now faced an avalanche of redemption requests. $7 billion. It was money that simply didn't exist. The house of cards was collapsing. Madoff desperately tried to raise funds. He contacted investors. He pressured the feeder funds. Nothing worked. The panic in the markets was too great. On December 9th, Bernie Madoff realized he had reached the end. There were no more maneuvers, no more exits. $65 billion in false promises were about to evaporate. On the morning of December 10th, Madoff summoned his 2 sons to the luxury apartment in Manhattan. Mark and Andrew worked at the brokerage in the legitimate trading business. They had always been kept at a distance from the 17th floor operation, or at least that's what they said. That morning, Bernie told them everything. He said the wealth management business was a lie, that he had never made a single real transaction, that he owed billions of dollars to people who had trusted him. Mark and Andrew were in shock. According to reports, Bernie wanted to use the following days to distribute the remaining money, around $200 to $300 million, to employees and family members before turning himself in. The sons refused. That same afternoon, Mark and Andrew contacted a lawyer. The lawyer contacted federal authorities. On the morning of December 11, 2008, 2 FBI agents knocked on the door of Madoff's apartment on the Upper East Side. Bernie answered in his bathrobe. "We're here to find out if there's an innocent explanation," said one of the agents. Madoff replied, "There is no innocent explanation." He confessed everything on the spot. The arrest was immediate. Bernie Madoff, former chairman of NASDAQ, Wall Street legend, wealth manager to celebrities and foundations, was led away in handcuffs. The news spread in minutes. Wall Street went into shock. How was this possible? Bernie Madoff? The discreet gentleman from Palm Beach? The man who rejected investors because the fund was too full? The numbers began to emerge, and they were devastating. $65 billion, the largest Ponzi scheme in history, bigger than any financial fraud ever recorded. 40,000 victims in 127 countries. The list of those harmed seemed endless. Elie Wiesel lost his entire foundation, $15 million. A Holocaust survivor,
stripped by a con artist from his own people. Hadassah lost $150 million. Steven Spielberg's foundation lost millions. Universities, hospitals, pension funds, all devastated. But the most shocking numbers were others. Many of the victims weren't millionaires. They were ordinary people who had entrusted a lifetime of savings to feeder funds that channeled everything to Madoff. Retirees who lost everything. Families left with nothing. There were suicides. A French investor, Thierry de la Ville-Huchet, slit his wrists in his New York office 2 weeks after the arrest. He had invested $1.4 billion of clients' money with Madoff. He couldn't live with the shame. A British investor, William Foxton, a decorated army major, shot himself in the head in a park in Southampton. He had lost all his savings. These deaths weren't statistics. They were direct consequences of a fraud the system allowed for decades. And Ruth Madoff, Bernie's wife? She said she knew nothing, that her husband had deceived her like everyone else. Few believed it. Ruth had worked at the brokerage for years. She had signed checks. She had moved accounts. How could she not know? But she was never criminally charged. The sons also swore innocence. Mark and Andrew insisted they had been deceived by their own father, that they never knew about the fraud until that December morning. The public was skeptical. The Madoff family became pariahs. Everyone associated with the name was treated as accomplices, guilty by association. On March 12, 2009, Bernie Madoff pleaded guilty to 11 federal crimes: securities fraud, money laundering, perjury, false testimony. The list was extensive. The prosecutor requested the maximum sentence. On June 29, 2009, Judge Denny Chin delivered the sentence: 150 years in prison. It was a symbolic sentence. Madoff was 71 years old. He would die behind bars. In the courtroom, several victims cried. Others applauded. One woman screamed, "Monster." Bernie Madoff was taken to the federal prison in Butner, North Carolina. But the story didn't end here, because the true devastation, the family tragedy, the lawsuits against the banks, the question of who really knew, all of that was still to come.
Bernie Madoff's imprisonment was only the beginning. What followed destroyed everything that remained of the Madoff name. Mark Madoff, the eldest son who turned in his father, never recovered. The public shame was unbearable. Lawsuits, death threats, the stigma of carrying that last name. On December 11, 2010, exactly 2 years after his father's arrest, Mark hanged himself in his New York apartment. His 2-year-old son was sleeping in the next room. He left a message for his wife, "Take care of Nikki," and a note for his father. 2 words, F you. Bernie Madoff found out in prison. According to reports, he cried for days. 2 years later, Andrew Madoff was diagnosed with cancer. He had been in remission for years, but the disease returned with full force after the scandal. Andrew directly blamed the stress caused by his father. He died in 2014. He was 48 years old. 2 sons, both dead before 50. One by suicide, the other consumed by disease and shame. Bernie's sister, Sandra Weiner, lived longer. But in 2022, she and her husband were found dead in an apparent suicide pact. They had lost everything in their brother's scheme, an entire family devastated. Ruth Madoff, the wife who knew nothing, lost everything except $2.5 million that authorities allowed her to keep. She lives today in isolation, rejected by the community that once adored her. But justice for the victims? That was more complicated. Irving Picard, the bankruptcy trustee appointed to recover funds, spent more than 15 years suing banks, feeder funds, and investors who had profited from the scheme. And here we come to the part few people know. JPMorgan Chase, the bank that maintained account 703 for 22 years, was sued for complicity. Court documents revealed everything: the internal warnings, the ignored reports, the quiet withdrawal of funds in 2008. Prosecutor Preet Bharara was clear. J.P. Morgan failed miserably in its legal obligations. And the result? In 2014, the bank paid $2.6 billion in fines, the largest penalty ever for a violation of the Bank Secrecy Act. But And here's the crucial point. No one went to prison. Not a single JPMorgan employee faced criminal charges. The bank admitted failures, paid the fine, and moved on. Attorney General Eric Holder justified it. Some banks are too big to fail, and apparently also too big to jail. Too big to fail, too big to jail. The system protected its own. As for the victims, the recovery was slow, but surprisingly effective. By December 2024, the compensation fund had recovered more than $14 billion. About 94% of actual losses were reimbursed to 40,000 victims, a remarkable success given that many expected to recover nothing. But money doesn't erase the trauma. It doesn't bring back the lost years. It doesn't resurrect those who took their own lives. And it doesn't resolve the fundamental question: how did this happen? How did one man deceive the world for decades while banks, regulators, and auditors looked the other way? The answer is uncomfortable, because the system wasn't Madoff's victim. The system enabled Madoff. And the most disturbing question of all, could it happen again? It would be comforting to think that the Madoff case was an isolated episode, an anomaly of the past, a lesson learned. But the facts say otherwise. October 2025, less than 3 months ago, HSBC announced a provision of $1.1 billion. Reason? Litigation related to the Madoff case. Read that again. Almost 17 years after the arrest, banks are still paying for the damages. HSBC was a custodian of feeder funds that channeled billions to Madoff. Allegedly, it failed in its supervisory duties. The lawsuits drag on in courts in Luxembourg, Ireland, and the United States. And HSBC isn't alone. UBS, Santander, banks on 3 continents continue to face lawsuits. Madoff's legacy refuses to die. But the real question is another. Has the system changed? The SEC was reformed after the scandal. New regulations were implemented. Feeder funds now face greater scrutiny. However, critics point to a disturbing pattern. The volume of derivatives in the global market is larger today than in 2008. Banking concentration has increased. The big banks are even bigger. And the too big to jail philosophy was never truly abandoned. When Credit Suisse collapsed in 2023, it was absorbed by UBS in a weekend. No trials, no imprisonments. The system, once again, protected itself. Bernie Madoff died in prison on April 14, 2021. He was 82 years old. He requested a presidential pardon from Trump, claiming terminal illness. It was denied. He died alone, without his sons, without his family, with 150 years of sentence left to serve. But his fraud exposed something no sentence can fix: a financial system built on blind trust, deficient regulation, and institutions that protect each other. The question isn't whether Madoff was caught. The question is how many still haven't been. JPMorgan knew. The SEC was warned 6 times. All the signs were there. And still, 40,000 people lost everything. The question remains, what really enabled Madoff's fraud? One man's greed, or a system designed to protect the powerful?